Fine. So, in the last class, so we were mainly looking at how do we install Nagios, right? So it's not like it's important or not, but majority of the times at the places wherever you're going to get started, there'll always be some installation done. So you have to understand more from the configuration. But if you're doing everything from the scratch, then you need to focus more from the installation. But still, it's always better to understand the installation so that if there is any problem, you should be able to debug it. So in that case, as we were seeing from the architecture, in Nagios, there are a couple of things which we need to know. So the first thing what we need to know is the directory structure. So as I was saying, by default, Nagios will be installed under user local Nagios folder. Okay, so once you install, there will be certain folders which will be created, and the reason why we need to know it, that is from where Nagios will be picking up all the files for its run. So in that case, it would be having a bin folder wherein all the binaries which is required for Nagios itself to run would be present. And there will be a folder called sbin, which will be containing all the CGI files, especially CGI files are nothing but a Perl file through which you can get the web page. Okay, and then you would have a libexe folder. This is where all the plugins that is required by Nagios to run will be present. Okay, and then you would have a share folder. This is where all the PHP files specific to reports that can be used from the dashboard can be obtained. Okay, and etc is the important folder here because this is the folder where it contains all the configuration files which will be read by Nagios and behave accordingly. And finally, var is the folder which contains the logs from Nagios, whether Nagios is running or not, or how it is running. All those details will be present in a log folder here. And similarly, it contains a log file which specifies what is the process Nagios is currently running on, or when Nagios is running internally on the Linux system, it will be creating a process ID. So those details can be obtained from here. So if you want to see the same, if you go to, okay, you can see this. So if you say bin, you can find the binaries. Then etc would have all the configuration files. Okay, and actually include is just extra folder if you have some additional configuration files that you have to put. And then the sbin will have all the CGI files. Okay, all the PHP files would be in the inside the share folder, and where will contain the logs. So especially if you go now and if you say you can see this is what currently the log that is being given from the Nagios, that what is running, and you see the file here called status.dat. This is the file which Nagios will be using for storing it as a database. Internally, when I say database, it doesn't mean that it uses exactly some kind of database, but this is the file where Nagios will be automatically updating with respect to each of the updates that it gets from the check which does it on different servers. So as soon as it does some check on a server, the server return backs the value, right? So that will be captured in this file, and through this file Nagios will be showing all the details on the dashboard. Okay, and further this log file, if you see, okay, you can see a process ID. So that is nothing but the process ID which Nagios is running on. You see, this is the one 50410. This is the process ID which Nagios is running. Okay, now for us, the important folder on which we will be working is the etc folder. Okay, that is where you have all the config files which we need to modify, and based on that we will be doing some checks. So the next thing what we need to know is the config files or the configuration files, because as I said, this is the important files which Nagios reads, and based on what you have defined and how you have defined, Nagios will be connecting to different servers and behaving it as per that. And for that, what it does, it uses the respective plugins to perform some action. Okay, so fine. So in that case, let's first understand what is these configuration files. 1 minute, please. Sorry for that. Okay. Um, so configuration files are the important files which we have to modify. So one advantage by using Nagios is, when I say this configure files, whenever you install Nagios, that is when you compile and install Nagios, Nagios creates the configuration files by default, wherein it will be created as a template. Okay, so you don't have to worry that you have to write everything from the scratch. So Nagios creates a template of all the configuration files which is required, and in that all you have to do is take the same existing structure and copy paste with the syntaxes what is required. So in that case, if you see, everything will have a template on defining a server, on defining what kind of check you have to do, when you have to do, what kind of groups you have to form. So like that, there are so many things which you can define, and for everything there will be certain templates which is already available, and by default that template will be used to check the host on which you are working. Suppose if you see that we install the Nagios on this VM, right? And in case if I want to monitor this VM itself, then you can use the existing template. So that's the only thing what you need to do, wherein copy paste the same existing syntax from the templates and just change the values to which server is it or whatever other values that we need, so that Nagios will be connecting to that server based on what you have given and does the checks accordingly. So if you see, in that case, configuration files are nothing but they are simply flat files, or you can just take from Windows. It's nothing but simple text files which contains some kind of templates. Okay, so every time when you run Nagios, it will go to this etc folder and read all the configuration files which is available in that, and based on that it will be behaving. So in that case, it is not like we will be dumping everything into one file itself. So there are many configuration files which is being put by Nagios for ensuring things are simple. So it's just like, if you're writing program, you define functions or subroutines, right? So you write it in separately, all the common groups, and you try to include it separately. So in the same way, here it writes all the different templates into separate files and include everything together in one file, so that it is easy for us to maintain it separately. Okay, now, so in that case, what and all are the config files and how it works is what we need to know. So whenever Nagios runs, Nagios first checks for a file called nagios.cfg, okay, which will be present in the etc folder. Now, using this file, all the other configuration files will be picked up, wherein CFG is just a short form for configuration. Okay, now wherein it doesn't literally matter, that means that CFG is something special for configuration. No, it's just a normal text file which you are ending the extension with CFG, because in Linux there is no extension. Okay, remember this. Unlike Windows, in Linux or Unix, there is no extension. So, wherein Linux or Unix will be just considering this as the name of the file itself. Okay, so in the that case, when Nagios run, the first file that it tries to read is etc nagios.cfg, wherein using this, all the other templates or the configuration files has to be defined. Wherein under the etc folder, there will be one more folder called objects, and inside that you will be having all the supporting configuration files. Okay, so using this, Nagios will try to read all the other configuration files, and then based on that, it will try to behave on what server to connect and which checks to do, when to do, how to do, all those things. It will be defined internally. So what we're going to do is, first let's start going through one by one and see how it works exactly. Okay, so the very first file, what it checks for us, nagios.cfg. Okay, so the first thing is, let's go to etc folder. Okay, so I am inside user local nagios etc, and in that, if you see, you will see a file called nagios.cfg, right? So this is the very first file which Nagios will be reading. So if you try to read this. Okay. Now, as I said, this acts both as a configuration file, but at the same time, it is a template. So if you want, you can modify. If not, by default, you can use the same thing, but change all the values based on your need. Okay. So this configuration file called nagios.cfg has all the primary definitions which is required by Nagios. Okay, so the first thing, if you see, it says that log underscore file, wherein log underscore file is a variable which Nagios is internally using. And now for that, there is a file that it has created. So if you see, this is the file which I was saying inside the folder called where, right? Wherein all the log files about Nagios run will be put. In case if you don't want and if you want to put into some other folder, then simply change the value here. Okay, and then further, if you see, all those variables which stand with cfg underscore file defines all the configuration files which Nagios has to read further after reading this nagios.cfg. So in that case, it is saying that you need to read a file called commands.cfg, contacts.cfg, timeperiod.cfg, template.cfg, and further it says it also has to read localhost.cfg, wherein it is not like all these files are separate files and it will execute separately. But as I said, these files contain some kind of configuration. So Nagios will read all this file, accumulate the configuration, what it has to do, and based on that, it will be running. Wherein, why we have made it separate? As the name indicates, each one of them serves a different purpose and has a particular value related to the name. So if you say localhost, this will contain all the definition of what server exactly you want to check. Okay, and then the time period will contain what is the specific time on which you have to connect to a server. Just like the cron job entry, you need to specify when you need to do some check on a particular server, right? So those details will be there. And then, for example, if you take commands.cfg, commands.cfg will contain all those commands which Nagios has to run to perform some check. Basically, when you say commands, it is nothing but which plugin has to be called for what check. Okay, and then for calling a check, you need to pass some parameters or not, because sometimes you might not just run some check, you might have to run some check, do some maths, like if you say space or memory utilization, you need to set a threshold for that, right? So in that case, you might have to pass some threshold by passing some parameters to those check. So in those case, all those definitions will be specified in this file called commands.cfg. Okay, and then the contacts.cfg will say whom should be sending the mail, whom should not be sending the mail, or like, or which group should be getting the notification alerts. All those details has to be set here. Okay, so like that, there will be multiple configuration files which you can create. So all you have to do is, if you are creating a new configuration files, add a line for cfg underscore file and put those values here so that Nagios will also read that file. Okay, further, you don't have to worry about all this pre-cache files. Okay, and now, as I said, resource file is the file which will contain all the macros. Okay, now what do you mean by that? So just like any kind of scripting or programming that you'll be using, macros are nothing but variables which can be reused. Okay, so for example, if you want to reuse certain value again and again, then if you want to define then in every configuration file, you have to define that, right? Instead of that, what you can do is you can create something called as macros and reuse it. So in this file called resource.cfg, you can specify all those values which you want to reuse it again and again, so that in the configuration file, you can simply call those variable name which will contain the values. Okay, so after this we will go and see this, wherein just assume this, that resource file or this resource.cfg is a file wherein, in case if you have certain values to be reused, you just put those values here, and based on the variable what you have specified, you will be reusing it in all the configuration files. Okay, and then here status.dat is the file where, as I said, Nagios will be storing all the monitored value. That means every time when it monitors a server, whatever details it does there, it will be dumping it into this file called status.dat. And the status update interval, which is nothing but how frequently do you want this status.dat should be updated. Okay, so here 10 means it is 10 seconds. And further, if you see, there are so many other values which is required, like Nagios user specifies who is the user who has all the control to handle the Nagios run. And specifically, the Nagios group is the group based on which who will be having the control. So all these definitions, if you see, this has been picked up when you're trying to configure and install. If you remember, when we had created all these users and we were running it, so when we are creating plugin, we had given all this option. So because of that, it is trying to pick up the value and trying to run one after the other. Okay, so pretty much this is what is required. But other than that, if you try to change any other values that you're seeing in this, accordingly Nagios would be behaving. But the important things what you need to know is only those what we saw in the beginning. But other than that, there is one more important thing that you need to specify is this. Suppose if this value is turned to 0, that means the log will not be putting it up. So what you have to do is just come down and ensure that this log notifications is always set to 1. Okay, suppose if you don't want everything to be logged, then you put it by 0. But by default, when you install Nagios, this will be set to 1. But in some cases, when it is not set to 1, that is, it is 0, then what you have to do is you need to make sure that there are certain values which you have to enable it to 1. Okay, so that is what is pretty much needed. But other than that, this file has all the configurations, how it has to do all those things, which is not pretty much important in the initial case. But other than that, the only important thing is how it picks up this file, right? So now once it does, it will be reading all these files. Now let's try to understand what these files are one by one and what it contains everything inside it. Okay, so before going that, let me just show you what is this resource.cfg. Okay, so now as I said, resource.cfg is an optional file wherein if you want, you can put some macros in it and we can reuse it. Okay, so now here is, if you see, by default, it is having one variable called user1. Okay, and what is the value of that? The value for user one that we have set is user local Nagios libexe folder. So that means whenever you are trying to use some plugin, rather than specifying the complete path, what you can say is simply you can use this variable or macro called user one, wherein this will be replacing it with this string called user local Nagios libexe. Okay, so this is how you can use this macros to get the complete value of whatever that you have put inside this macros. So in that case, when you're defining a macro in Nagios, this is the syntax, okay, wherein you have to start with dollar, then user one and dollar. And when you're retrieving the value, it will be pretty much the same, wherein you say dollar user one and you get the value what you have stored inside this macros. So like this, any kind of value that you want to reuse it, pretty much create a variable name or a macro name and put the content inside it. Okay, fine. So the important thing after this, what you need to know is we'll go to objects folder, and this contains all the required CFG. Okay, so the first and the foremost thing which you need to know is the localhost.cfg, wherein this is a CFG which defines what kind of servers that you are working on and how it works. All those details will be present. Okay, so for the first time it might be a little confusing, but as you keep seeing it for some more time and then it'll be easy for you to understand, because like I said, it's all templates. So if you just copy paste and redefine with a particular name, things will work as it is. Okay, fine. So the first thing, like I said, okay, we had some config file called nagios.cfg which will have all the definitions and everything is fine. So our primary requirement is, given any server, we have to do some check against it, right? So first thing what we need to do is we need to define about that server. So in that case, say that you have one more VM and you want to check something against it, then the first thing what you need to do is you need to define the details about that host. Okay, so that will be done in this file called localhost.cfg. But is it mandatory that you should do it in this? No. If you want, you can create your own CFG file, but the only thing what you need to know is you need to follow the syntax whenever you are defining a host. Okay, so as the name indicates here, if you see, define host is the syntax or the template which you should be using for defining a host. Okay, now by default, if you see, it is giving us the template, and localhost is the host on which you are currently running this Nagios. So it is giving you a template for the same server on which it is running. So all you have to do is copy paste this value and modify it according to which server you want to connect. So for now, let's try to understand what these values are. Then we will try to do one check of a different server and see how it works. Okay, so the first thing is the template. So define host is the template which specifies what is the host or what is the machine which you want to connect and do some check, or which is the server or the machine for which you need to do the monitoring. Okay, so define host is the syntax and the template. Inside that, the first thing, if you see, there is a word called use Linux server. Okay, wherein whenever you see something called use in Nagios, then that represents further a smaller template, which means a template is nothing but a group of values which is being used by all the different configurations in a common way. Okay, so we will not go completely into the templates for now, but what this means is this is a name which is trying to point to a group of values which can be reused again and again. So for example, now you are saying that this is a server. Okay, so for that server, when you want to connect, how you want to connect, all those things you are specifying. Suppose you are adding one more server, or your data center can have 10, 20 to 25 servers. Now, for all those 25 servers, you will be putting in the same values, right? So instead of that, what you can create in Nagios is you can group all those common values and you can create them as a template and simply use the name of the template so that all those values which you are trying to repeat can be replaced here. Okay, so that is the purpose of a template. So how do you use a template? The template will be used by the word called use, wherein where will be the definition for all these templates? It will be present in the CFG file called template.cfg. Okay, so we will see it further, but first, what's more important is to understand this definition for the host. Okay, so like this, now for now you just assume that it is using some standard template which Nagios is giving, and that is being defined by Linux server. So that means in case if you are going to monitor a Linux based server, then you use this definition. Okay, wherein you use this template first and whatever values it is there, it will be replaced. So other than that, what is important to define a host? So the very first thing you need to say is what is the name of the host? Okay, now since it is saying local host, which is nothing but the server which you want to monitor. Okay, and alias is nothing but a short name to quickly identify what is the server, because what will happen is when you say host name, generally in production the host name will not be like just, it will be server name at the rate company name dot domain name dot com, so it will be very huge. So instead of that, if you want to quickly identify it, you can give a shorter name for that server or which machine you are trying to monitor. Okay, and then address represents the IP address of that server which you want to connect. So like this, no matter how many servers you want to monitor, you will be creating a separate definition like this, and in that you will be adding all the corresponding values on the name of the server and then specifically the IP address. So these two things are the important things which Nagios requires to monitor any server. Okay, fine. So once you have defined a host, then what is that you have to do? Okay, now fine. So you have defined a host. Now whenever Nagios have to connect to it, it will connect to that server. But before that, what is that you have to do after connecting to that server? You need to monitor, right? So how will you monitor? So for that, you need to specify all those details. So in that case, all those monitoring things are called as services, wherein services internally represents a particular check which you need to monitor on a particular machine. Okay, again, now for that service we again have a template. Okay, now the difference here is when you're defining a host, you will be defining it only once because there is only one host name, right? But for a host, you might be have to do or monitor various checks. So like I said, you might be interested to check the whether the server is up or not. You might have to check whether the server has enough memory space. You need to check whether the load average on the server or the CPU utilization is always lower. Like this, for a single server or a single machine, you can do many checks. So in that case, each one of the check correspondingly indicates a service in Nagios. So in that case, for each host, you can have different or many services. So in that case, the next thing after defining the host, what we need to do is define the services for each of the check. Okay. So how do you define that service? So again, for that, if you see, it has a similar template wherein if you say define service within the flow buckets, whatever details that you do, it will be considering for that particular server, wherein try to understand, you have to define a service for each kind of check for each server. Okay, so that is what you're going to do. So by default, what we'll do is we will define a service for a particular kind of check, and this can be reused by any server that you want specifically. Okay, fine. So in that case, now if you see, there is something again I have specified here by use, wherein use represents a template which you are going to use commonly. Okay, that again we will see. But other than that, what is important? The first thing is the host name, wherein host name says for which host you are trying to run this service. Okay, so we are saying localhost, wherein this is the short name which we have defined sometime back here. Okay, so you have to remember this. For example, if you used a server called XYZ, then that is the server or machine against which you do have to do some monitoring. So now that is the details that you will specify here. So when you say host name, then you will be specifying that XYZ. Okay, so once that is done, the next thing is you need to specify the details about what kind of checks you are doing. Okay, so when you say what kind of checks, then it is what it is defined by the service description, wherein it just says what is that you are trying to do here. It is just some small description, but other than that, this is not going to do anything. So service description is a string which is used to just quickly identify what is the service used for. Okay, so here if you see, we are using a check for ping. Ping is nothing but a command or a service which checks whether you are able to communicate to the particular server. Okay, fine. So once you have set the service description, the next thing is you need to specify exactly what this service has to do, right? So that is most important thing, is that you are specifying against which server or which machine you want to run, but what exactly you want to run. So that will be defined using check command. Okay, now here you need to understand this, how this syntax works. Okay, so if you see, you have given some values here, right? Now what are these values? So in order to understand this, first let's split this and see what it is. So anything that you see by this exclamatory mark represents a parameter that you are passing. Okay, try to understand this. Anything that you see with exclamatory mark are nothing but parameters. So in this case, for this service called ping, you are passing two parameters. Okay, what is that parameters? This whole value is one parameter. Okay, now maybe that this service needs some values like this. Okay, fine, let's not worry about what values you are passing for now, but we are passing two parameters or two values to this particular service. Okay, now in that case, what is the exact command that you are trying to call, right? So that is what here it represents by check ping, wherein check ping is a command which you are calling whenever you call ping. That means for this host called localhost, you are calling a command or a check or a service called check ping, for which you have specified two parameters. Okay, and internally, if you see what is this check ping, again will be defined in a separate commands.cfg. So if you remember, there was one more configuration file called command.cfg, wherein all the definition about what is this exact command does internally, and whenever you are passing some parameters, how it has to behave, all those things will be handled. So if you see, this localhost.cfg is a simple file which just defines what is that you need to do. Okay, so one by one we will go further and see all these things will be and how it behaves. Wherein here you are just defining the service. So for this local host, you are trying to do some service called checkping, which gets some values or two parameters like this. Okay, now what is this checkping? Checkping is a default plugin which is being given by Nagios. Like this, in case if you want to modify this to some other script, you can do that also. So we will see all those complicated things little later. But for now, as I said, Nagios gives you lot of plugins. Let's see that also once again. So where are we? So inside the Nagios local user local Nagios, you will be having a libexe folder. So as I said, this is where all your plugins will be present. So whatever commands that it is calling here internally, if you see, it is nothing but the name of the plugins that you will be using it here. Then that you have actually compiled and created. In the last class, if we saw, we basically tried to compile and create some plugins, right? So those are nothing but all this which we have created here. Okay, so you see you have a file, and simply if you want to cross check that. Okay, now if you don't know how this works, you can pretty much run it in the help mode, and that will tell you what parameters that you need and how you need to run. Okay, so here what is it saying? When you're running this command, it requires some parameters. Okay, and in that, if you see, it is requiring a parameter for what is the warning state and what is the critical state. Okay, so these values internally represent some warning. So when it says 100 comma 20, it is not like you are passing it here. It is the syntax of this plugin that it requires two values. If you see that, if a value that you're trying to ping, and if the value is ranging between 100 and it is always below 100, or it is ranging between 100 to 500, then it means that it is a warning. So but any value which is less than 100, then it is not a warning, it is fine. But suppose if the value reaches 500, then that means the 500 is the bytes which you try to receive, then it means that it is a critical warning. So what will happen immediately when you run the ping command, and then in case if you get the value which is 500 or more than that, then it will assume it is as critical. So that is what you will be passing the values, and all these definitions that will be present in the commands.cfg, wherein here you are just defining the service. Okay, so like this, there will be so many plugins which will be available. What we need to understand is we need to just go through this and try to say what is the plugin that we want to work, or what is the service that we want to work. Correspondingly, what is the plugin name that is going to be used for that service. Okay, so similarly, if you see, there will be lots of services which is defined. So now here, if you see, suppose if you want to check your local disk space for the partition that you have used, okay, then in that case, this is the plugin which is used for checking up the partition. Now, say that at some point of time you want to know how many users have connected to a server, because if there are too many people who have connected to a server and they are trying to work, then it might be some problem. So in that case, if you want to limit, you can do a limit also. So for that, what you do, there is one plugin called check local users. Okay, what this will do, it will basically try to check whether there are number of users, or how many number of users have connected to a particular machine and working on that. So in that case, if you see, the first thing is you are using some template called local service. Okay, so we will see this template on what you have, but other than that, the first thing you need to say is for which server you need to do this service. So in that case, host name will define for which server you are trying to check it. So in that case, localhost is the server against which you are trying to check. Okay, then here command is the important thing which specifies what you need to check against this. Okay, so you are saying that check local users is the command which needs to be called whenever you are calling this current users or this service. Okay, and for that you are passing some parameters called 20 and 50. And what this parameters does, even we don't know, but internally by default it is giving. So like this, if you are creating your own service, you are creating your own plugin, then you have to specify the command what you need to call, and correspondingly if you have to pass some values, you will be specifying. Okay, so like this there are so many other services which is present. So like this, if you see, if you want to see how many services are being defined, and then if you want to check if there is any load on the server and what is that load, all those data will be given here. So like this, what is important is for each check or for each service, you need to define a service for each server. So the only thing what you need to understand here is, suppose if you have 25 servers, like I said, and each of the server needs say some 4 to 5 checks to be done, then you need to do 25 servers into 4 checks what you have to do. That means for each server you need to define all the 4 services. So the only thing what you need to do is you need to copy paste this and rewriting it. So initially it might look it is a difficult thing. So either if you want you can manually do it, or you can simply write one script and try to reproduce the same value. So in this, if you say now if I add another 24 servers, the only values that it will be changing is this name of the server against which you need to do, right? So simply if I copy paste and change this local host to some other XYZ, then for that server called XYZ or machine called XYZ, it will also do this check or this service. So like that, you can write some small script and try to quickly get the values added to the same localhost.cfg, or you can simply add it in one more CFG file for each of the server. So however you want, you can do it. But the important thing what you need to do is you have to define this same syntax or the template what you're seeing. Okay, fine. So now let's take one by one and let's go, because let me not confuse you too much. So let's take one service now. So the first thing what we did was we tried to define a server or a host. So for that we defined what is the name of the server, and then you need to specify the short alias name and then the IP address. And then once it is done, you have to define a service. So let's just take one service here. So for this service, if you say, you need to specify for which host you want to monitor or for which machine you want to call the service, and then you need to specify what exactly is that service, right? Okay, so now like I said, this is not an actual plugin name, but this is a command name that you're trying to call and you're trying to pass some parameters. So now let's try to see the commands.cfg and see how each one has been defined. So it will be present in the etc folder inside your user local Nagios, and inside that you have a folder called objects. Okay, so let me make it a little wide so that it will be easy for you to see. Okay, so here we have a file called command.cfg. Okay, now here again, if you see, you will be having templates which defines what each of the command is about. Okay, so now our interest is to check for a command called checkping, right? So let's quickly go to checkping. Okay, so here if you see, we have defined a command called checkping, right? So do you have anything else? Yes, we have here also. Fine. So okay, they have defined only in two things. Now, if you see, this checkping is the actual plugin name that we are going to use. Okay, so instead of that, let's try to see this and try to get one. Okay, now how do you define a command? As the name indicates, first you use the word called define and then the word called command. So that specifies that you are actually trying to define some command. Okay. Now here, for defining a command, what and all values that you need. So the first thing what you need to know is what is the name of the command, that is check ping. So if you try to see internally, this is nothing but the value or the string which you have specified here. Okay, try to be clear. Now when you say check command, whatever that you have given here is the name of the command which you are trying to call. Okay, but internally that doesn't mean that you are going to execute this. It is just a string which you are trying to call. So whatever string that you give here, Nagios will come to the command.cfg and it will check for a value called command name which has the same string what you had. So suppose here if you say check underscore ping underscore one, and here if you have specified check underscore ping underscore one, then it will come here exactly. Okay, so this is just the name to identify what command you are trying to call, wherein that is not the exact command. Okay, try to be clear. Then what this command has to do is what the command line is going to specify. Okay, so every definition of the command needs to have two values, that is one name of the command to identify, and then second is what exact is the command line which you need to execute. Okay, so now if you see here, whenever you are calling this service called check ping, it internally comes and executes this line. Okay, now when it is executing this line, what is it is trying to do? It is just trying to call some plugin called checkping. Okay, now if you see, this is the actual plugin name. Okay, now why is it both of them has been given the same name? Because it is easy for us to identify. So now if you always store a command name with the same name as the plugin, it is easy for us to identify, saying that okay, now this check ping is nothing but you are trying to call a plugin called check plugin. Instead of that, in case if you have given some other name, that it should not be confusing. So since it is a template what Nagios is giving, it always uses the same name of the command as that of the plugin name. So every time you call a command internally, Nagios is going to call a plugin corresponding to it. So like I said, now where is all the plugin present? Plugins are present in a folder called libexe. And if you remember, we had created a macro called user1 in the resources.cfg. Now, every time you are using this, see, they are trying to use the macro. So now you are actually calling a plugin which is present in the libexe folder. Okay, so this is what the exact command is doing. So for that, what you are trying to do, you are trying to pass some parameters, wherein -h is the first parameter which requires the name of the server against which this plugin should run. So for that, if you see, by default, there is a macro which is being created by system generated, wherein user1 is a macro which we created, but host address is a macro which Nagios knows by itself. So how does it know? Whenever you are calling this service like this, then host address is nothing but this name of the server. So now using this name, it will go up to the definition and it will try to read the IP address. So that work internally Nagios will be doing. And then second thing here, if you see, for this plugin called checkping, you need to first specify what server you want to run this command or this plugin called checkping, and then you need to specify what is the warning value and what is the critical value. So whenever you are running ping command, you will be getting some output. So based on that, you need to say whether the server is in a warning state or in a critical state or it is okay. So when you specify some value here, it whenever the value reaches this warning value, then it will be indicating it as warning. And suppose when it indicates anything lesser than that, then it won't display anything. Okay, so only when the value touches whatever value that you're giving or more, then it will say warning. So in the same case, if you need to specify a critical value also, you can specify. So in that case, now any value that is between this value and this value will be called as warning. But as soon as it touches this and anything more than this, it will alert it as critical. Okay, so we will see more about what is the status and all, but for now you just have to understand this. So like this, if you see, there are so many plugins that you have defined wherein each one of them has its own syntax. So now if you see in this local host.cfg, in a service, you will be calling some string or the name of the command, wherein what exactly this command does is internally specified by this commands.cfg file. Okay, try to understand, wherein this is just the name of the command which you are trying to invoke as a reference, but internally command line is the command where exactly you specify what plugin that you are trying to use, and for that what and all values that you have to use. So here if you see the two values that you have passed, that is after exclamatory mark, if you give some value, that will be taken as first parameter, and after that if you give one more exclamatory and then give values, then it will be considered as second parameter. So that values should be taken by a standard macro called arg1, or arg1 represents the first parameter that you have passed to this definition of the command, and arg2 represents the second parameter what you have passed it to this particular service or to this particular command. So now if you see, we have how many definitions? We had a configuration called resource, and then we had localhost in which we had specified this particular host name, and then we specified we want to do some check called ping. And once again, we have one more file called commands.cfg in which we will specify exactly what commands you need to call against this command. That is, what is the exact plugin name which you will be calling against this particular check. Okay, so as I said, it is better to have each one of them separated in separate CFGs so that it is easy for us to maintain. If not, if everything is present in the same file, then it will be quite confusing. Okay, now if you understand, nagios.cfg is first called. From nagios.cfg, it calls localhost. Then the localhost, it will then further go to this commands.cfg and resource.cfg and try to get all this values that you need. Okay, so is it clear until now at least how you define one host and how do you define one service? And for that, if you see how the command will be defined internally.
Okay, I have a question, but not regarding configuration, uh, but it's regarding to the include directory. So, may I ask?
Yeah, 1 minute, I'll explain you.
Hello. Okay, okay.
Yeah, before that, any questions in this? So as I said, it might be a little confusing in the beginning, but this is a standard template which Nagios follows. So all you have to do is, try to understand this syntax and all the flow, how it works. Because going forward, when you are trying to maintain something, you will be just modifying this. That's it. You will not be actually doing anything from new. The only thing what you need to do is you just have to copy paste this and try to modify. That way, we'll take it as an example and try to do. But here just for understanding, I'm just going through one by one in a simplest form so that you can understand it. So are you guys able to get, or is it quite confusing which you need to go through it again? Sneha? Hello?
Hello. Okay.
Yeah, any doubt? Okay, yeah. So what was your question?
My question regarding to the include directory, you told us about the include directory that extra configuration if we want, then we have to configure in this directory. So I want to know that what kind of extra configuration we have to know.
Okay, that I'll come to you later, because if I tell you now itself, it'll be quite confusing. Now, all those things when you said, right, there's SMS, and you want to set up some configuration additionally that you can put it into that. That is what it is being used.
Okay, when we are connecting to the another servers to the Nagios servers, so what about the security terms that we are connecting two servers each other? So infra is also in behind, sorry, in mid of all both servers.
Yeah, firewall would be there. So if you're not inside the same network, then you'll not be allowed to do. So pretty much you are connecting to all the servers which is present in your network in the company, right? It'll be inside the same
Mhm.
network.
Okay, and one more question that writing about a plugins, you ask tell us something about writing about plugins. So how can we write a plugins?
Yeah, we will see it slowly. I mean, let's first try to see how this works one by one, and after that, we'll
Okay,
go
okay,
to the
sorry.
plugin. Okay,
Okay, okay, sorry.
no problem. I'll show you one by one. Don't worry. Okay,
Okay, thank
so
you.
okay, so now we were seeing from the commands.cfg, we saw from local host.cfg, right? Now I'll show you what is this templates.cfg. Okay, now if you go back, we were using this first thing is local service, and then we used something called Linux server. So when I said whenever you have this term called use, it is nothing but a template, wherein template is a group of values which you can reuse it again and again. Okay, so in that case, let's try to search and see what is that definitions or the template that you have. Okay, so so now, so if you see, there's a lot of definitions what it is trying to give, but to take it as a simple term, now when you say define host here, it is trying to say for a host definition, this is the template that you're going to use. Okay, so in that case, now name represents that whatever template name that you are using for a host only. So like this, you can have template for different thing. That doesn't mean that one template should be used for all the configuration. That means you have a service, you have a host, you cannot use the same template for both, because the values would be differing. For a host you need certain values, but for service you need different values. Okay, so in that case here, if you say you are defining a host name, and for the host is not actually the host, but it is a template internally which can be reused. So in that case, now when you say Linux server, it is for a host which you are defining. And what and all that you are seeing. Okay, the first thing is it is saying generic host, right? Now, what is this again? It is saying again use generic host. That means it is internally using one more template called generic host. And if you just look up, this is the template first it is using, and further these are the values. Okay, so here if you see what is this template that you are using, it has some values. So whenever you are using these values, that is the template, all these values will be taken internally for this host. So like this, so any kind of host that you are defining, if you use this value called Linux server, then it will be replacing that with all these values. So this means simply instead of writing all these lines every time when you create a host, you simply put everything inside this template called Linux server and you reusing it. And if you see what these values are, the first thing you are seeing is notification is enabled. So when you say notification, you remember these values were present in what? Inside your nagios.cfg. So here you have an option of overwriting whatever values that you have present in the nagios.cfg. So like that, nagios.cfg is going to give you a common value, but you can choose for each server a particular configuration can be set or not set. Okay, so in that case here, notification enabled, when it's one, that means whenever something goes wrong in this server, then it has to be notified. Okay, then the second thing is event handler. Event handler is nothing but you're doing some service, right? So whenever it is changing the state from one state to other, that means when you say state, it might be working fine, but suddenly it might not work fine. Or when you take back the example as the check ping, we were giving some value called 100 and 500 for critical, right? Suppose if the value which the server returns is less than 100, then it means it is completely fine. But as soon as the value goes 100 or above 100, then the state of the server is considered as warning. So in that case, what will happen is the event has been changed from normal to warning. And then when the value goes beyond 500, then the state gets changed from warning to critical, or there is an event called correspondingly a event called critical is being triggered. So event is nothing but a state when server tries to change from one state to other state. Okay, so do you want to get notified for that, or when you want to handle all those things internally by Nagios is what you say one. So wherever you say one, that means it is enabled. Okay, so like that, the important thing which you need to know is notification period. Now here if you say notification period says 24/7, that means you need to keep getting mails throughout the day, or do you want to get only the mail or the notifications for the first 8 hours of the day, because only on the first 8 hours you will be working, right? The rest of the time you will not be working. So like that you can specify the value. Okay, so these are the common values which will be reused for all the servers, and all these things are stored as one template called generic host, and that is what you are giving it here. So when you give this word called use generic host, all these values will be replaced in this particular place. So if you have 25 servers, like I said, then it'll be a huge configuration file wherein you are reusing the same values again and again. So instead of that, you group them as a template and you put it like this. Okay, and what other values that you have in this Linux server? If you see, it is saying that check period is 24/7. Yes. So now how and when you want to check that? So I am saying this, you want to check this other 24/7. So it has to keep on checking throughout the day. Okay. Now, but you haven't said when exactly you have to check. Okay, you are saying that, okay, you have to check it all throughout the day, but do you want to run it all the 24/7? No, that means what is the interval that you want to check? So the check interval is going to say that when exactly you want to check. Okay, so in that case, the check interval, whatever you see 5, this represents that every 5 minutes this check has to be performed, or this service has to be performed, or basically you have to check the host or whatever that you have defined every 5 minutes. Okay, so that is what the check interval is all about. Now suppose if there is some problem, then when is that you want to do, or do you want to retry it? So basically the retry interval specifies that every 1 minute that you need to check for the host. Suppose if it is not working or if it is not connecting, then after 1 minute try to check whether it is running. Okay, and like that the maximum check attempts which says 10 is nothing but if you try to connect to the server for 10 times and if it doesn't work, then stop it. But until 10 times, you keep running it. Okay, and then what is this check command? So you try to understand here, you are not trying to run a service. And what is this you are trying to do? You are defining a host. So that means there are two things which Nagios does. So first thing what Nagios does is every 5 minutes, it will try to run this command called check host alive to see whether the host is alive. That is, the host is connectable. Okay, then after that it will be running the service what you have defined, wherein the service we are not coming it to the template, but here what we are trying to see is from the host you have defined something called Linux server, and that is the template that we are trying to see here. Okay, don't get confused again. This is the template which you used while defining the host. Okay, yeah, can you hear me?
Now we can. Yeah.
Okay, so what I was trying to tell is this host definition, we have user template. So this template will be used only for the host definition, wherein if you see what it means is here every 5 minutes, Nagios will be checking for the server whether it is connecting or not, or whether it is actually up and running. And in that case, what command that it will use? Internally, it is going to use a command called check host alive. So now if you see, even the host definition is using a command wherein what is this command? If you just check here, check -host -alive. So now if you see, even this is trying to use the same plugin called checkping, wherein it is hard coding some value and it is trying to check. So what it does is every 5 minutes, it will try to ping the server. And if the server is pingable, that means that the server is alive and it is running. Okay, so like this, it will be checking it throughout the day, and for every 5 minutes, it will try to do. Okay, and now if you want to see all the further details like when exactly you want to send, it will be trying to send notification every 2 hours if something goes wrong. Okay, and now wherein here, when you say the notification options, DUR is nothing but some state of the server against which it will be sending notification. So I'll be telling you what are these states of the servers in little further. So like this, if you are trying to see, this is nothing but a template for a server. So all these values will be reused for all the servers that you are trying to check. Okay, fine. Now in the same way, now if you see for this service, you have used a template called local service. And now if you want to see this, okay, so here you see you have defined a template. That means not us. Nagios has defined a default template and it is using certain values. So anytime for any kind of service you use this local service, that means see here, even for this service you're using this, and even for this service you're using. So any value that you are going to specify here will be replaced it. So rather than writing like 10 lines here, 10 lines here, what we are trying to do is we are trying to group them as one template and we have put it here. Okay, wherein what this is going to do, the first thing it is saying that it is using another template called generic service, and that is what you're seeing on the top. And other than that, what values it is saying? So now it is saying that the max check attempts is 4. That means how many times you have to keep on checking if that command is running or not. Okay, and then the normal check interval, that is 5 minutes. So this means every 5 minutes this service, whatever that you have specified here, right? Because when you use this, you are internally using this value. That means this service, whatever you have specified here, is going to be checked every 5 minutes. Okay, like that, this is the place where you can tweak to say that when it has to be checked. So every time you use this template called local service, then that service will be checked every 5 minutes against the server what you're trying to check. So every 5 minutes, what Nagios will do is it will try to run this command where internally this command it is going to call some plugin. So this is how Nagios will be trying to connect to some server and try to run a service against the time that you have given. Okay, so just like that, if you see this generic service is again a template wherein it will be specifying some value here. So instead of writing all these values again and again for all those servers, like 25 servers that you're going to get, and for that 25 servers you have four checks is what I said, right? So that will be like 100 services totally. So instead of writing this 30 lines or 40 lines for 100 services, you can group them simply and you can reuse them all those values, wherein all these things are standard values which is required by Nagios to work on. So at least are you getting it now? Why do we need templates? Because all these things are default values which will be specified. Now, like that, every time you put some values, we will be trying to reusing a template. Getting it? Hello?